Company dismissed. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to another episode of Sky Blue History, the podcast where we take a deep dive into a rich and fascinating history of Coventry City Football Club. I'm your host, Claudio, and today we've got a real treat for you. Joining me, as always, our club historian, Jim Brown, whose wealth of knowledge on all things Sky Blue never ceases to impress. And today, we're incredibly lucky to have a very special guest, the former player and manager of Coventry City, Steven Pressley. Elvis, as he's fondly known, played an integral role in the club during some pivotal years, both on the pitch and in the dugout. And in this episode, we'll be talking about his time at the club, his thoughts of the evolution of Coventry City, and some behind-the-scenes stories that you won't want to miss. So sit back, relax, and let's dive straight into the Sky Blue history with two men who've lived it firsthand. Well, first of all, good evening, Jim. I no doubt you'd like to introduce Stephen as well.
Good evening, Claudio. Yes, welcome, Stephen. I think I've told you before, but I was born in the same town as you in Scotland, so I've always felt a great affinity with you.
Very good.
Starting straight away, Steve, I'll talk about current, because normally what we do is we talk a little bit about what's been happening in the current state of affairs at Coventry City, and my wife recently, I believe you did a punditry for Sky recently for one of our live matches.
Yeah, that's right.
Which one was it?
It was the Sheffield United game at the home game at the.
Yeah, and I'd recorded it and I was watching it back, and you were speaking, and my wife says, "Who's that chap?" I thought, "Oh, Steven Pressley." Why? She says, "Well, he seems to know what he's talking about." Great compliment. She never says that to me when I'm talking about football. So what do you think of what's happening at Coventry City with at the moment?
I think for some time the club's been moving in the right direction. You know, I think a great deal of credit goes to Mark Robbins in that respect. You know, and there's been a lot of support mechanisms behind them. But I think that you know, certainly since my time at the club, it's moved in the right direction in the sense that I think Mark put certain processes in place. He got a grip of the recruitment department, made a lot of very good signings throughout his time. Not only did he sign good players, he then developed them, enhanced them, and from a business perspective, sold them. So, you know, I think there's been many good things happening at the club. Finally, off the pitch, a degree of stability, which is extremely important to any organisation. You know, my own club just now that I'm working at, Brentford, is a club that has enormous stability, and you know, you see firsthand just how important that is to the growth of it. So they've had that off the pitch, they've had that now for some time with Mark, and hopefully, you know, the same applies to Frank, where he gets time, he gets an opportunity to bring stability and growth to the club. And I think that that's been a really important aspect. You know, it was a lot of change. I was in the job for 2 years, which, you know, isn't a great deal of time, but there was a lot of change before me and then after me. So I don't think that in itself breeds real success, but you know, I think they've certainly moved in the right direction since then.
So if you're stepping into a job now, after someone who's been in a job for 8 years, what would you ask for? How would you approach it? Would you have like an ABC of ideals as you walk in?
You mean with regards Frank coming
Yeah,
into the job? Well, I would have hoped that that when he walked in, there was a lot of processes already in place. A lot of good work done by Mark, and I think that it wasn't a case of coming in and making any radical changes. It was a case of continuing on from pretty much where Mark had left, and then bringing some new and additional ideas to that. I don't think there was any, hand grenade required. Far from it. I think the complete opposite. And I think Frank's shown that he's not come in there making too many changes. He's made several tactical tweaks, but that aside, I think that the real growth will come just from time in the job and slowly but surely making small amendments. And I think he's shown a good experience and understanding of that thus far.
Now we've got Leeds United tomorrow night, which you probably know.
Yes.
So it's at home. Do you get up to the CBS much? And what do you think our chances are tomorrow?
Well, I don't get up there very often, I'll be honest. I'm still living in the area. I'm still in Leamington. I've been here now 11, 12 years. But, I think obviously both clubs go into this game on the back of some good results and good performances. So it certainly makes for a very intriguing game. Leeds are, at this moment in time, probably the team most fancied to win the division. But, I think under Frank, is this now four league wins in a row, I believe, 5 in all competitions. So there'll be good confidence around them. So, I think it's a real interesting game, but it'll probably be the biggest challenge thus far.
What do you think, Jim, tomorrow night?
Yeah, I agree with Stephen. I think Leeds are the best side in the division. I think they're heading for automatic promotion. They've got a big squad, an experienced manager who's won promotion before, and I think they blew it last year, but I think they've got a stronger squad now, and I think they'll give us a very tough game tomorrow.
Yeah, I agree. Although I'm sitting on the fence and going for a draw. I'll take a draw tomorrow night. Quite happy.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I'll hand this bit over to you now because I'm sure you want to get stuck into Stephen.
Yes. Well, Stephen, you've had a stellar career as a player. I didn't really appreciate how stellar it was until I did a bit of research. But I understand you're the only man that's won the Scottish Cup with 3 different teams.
Yeah, very true.
You had a great career with, obviously starting with Rangers and then Coventry, the brief spell at Coventry, but Dundee United, Hearts, where you're a legend by all accounts. Even popped into Parkhead for a little while, and ended it by getting to the Scottish Cup final with Falkirk. That must have been the first for a long time at Falkirk. But perhaps I suppose the Coventry City period was the only period where you didn't have success. And it'd be interesting to know, well, first of all, how you came to join Coventry City, and then perhaps talk about what you thought of your brief time there.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I came up through the ranks at Rangers. I'd been there since 12 years of age, and obviously joined Coventry, I think, around 21. And I was very fortunate enough to come up through the Rangers ranks at that time and develop through the club, especially when you look at the types of personnel that were there, the great players. Like we had the England captain, Terry Butcher. We had one of the Scottish captains, Richard Gough. We had Mark Haitley. We had, Trevor Stephen. We had so many top players at that time, international players, Brian Laudrups, all outstanding professionals. And the one thing that was very apparent there was that the only result that was accepted was a win. So standards were incredibly important. So I was very fortunate enough to come through at a club where standards were set so high. You know, I tell people to this day, we used to have to turn up to training with a shirt and tie on every day. Thus were the standards of that football club. But following on from that, I then broke into the first team, and then for 2 or 3 years played several games, would come out, didn't manage to hold down a regular place, which is quite understandable for a young centre-half, especially when you consider, as I've said, the types of names and the types of players that were around that time. But one of the most probably influential aspects at that time that changed was my father's death. My father died, and he was a real stabiliser for myself. You know, he was somebody that I always leaned on for advice, gave me really good advice, really good support, but was also very honest with me. And I had a 2-year contract on the table, but I was so desperate to play first team football on a regular basis that I turned down the offer to move to a club where I could potentially play first team football. Now, as I've said, my father probably at that time would have steered me in a different direction. He would have explained to me my age, you know, how I needed to be a little bit more understanding of the process, and probably I would have stayed there. But at that time, as I've said, I was desperate for the change, desperate for the opportunity. So Coventry came and approached me and were going to give me that opportunity. But the reality was that I wasn't really ready for it at that time. You know, I was a young defender, still very inexperienced in many ways, but probably thought that I was further ahead on the curve than I actually was. And I think it was actually the first year of the Premiership, but at that time as well, Scottish clubs could compete financially with English clubs in many ways. But as I said, I chose to come down and apply my trade at Coventry, and it was a great opportunity for me. I think it was the first year of the new Premiership. So I came down, and my time at the club was a mixed bag of performances, really. You know, I had some very promising performances and some really indifferent performances. And I think it was very much where I was in my own development. You know, at times looked a player, at times looked very inexperienced. And that's how I would have described my season with Coventry City. Some memorable games and some very indifferent games.
Jim told me that he thinks in your first 8 matches you had 7 yellow cards and a sending off. Do you reckon that's part of the inexperience? Did you struggle to cope? I mean, was it, although the Scottish clubs could compete financially, was there still a bit of a difference between the 2 league divisions in terms of the football played?
Yeah, I still think there was a definite difference, yes, but not the gulf that we're seeing today. Certainly not that. But the reality was that I wasn't fully ready to play week in, week out at that moment. You know, I think my inexperience showed, you know, what you've said around the 7 yellow cards and a sending off was very much where I was in my development. You know, inexperienced, mistakes, poor decision making. But within that, there was some really good performances, but just not enough. And especially as a centre back, because as a centre back, consistency is key. And I just wasn't ready at that period of time. But it was a great learning curve. And the other thing, like I said, it was different at that time. We didn't have the ability, the social media. We didn't have the ability to use mobiles or Zoom to phone home, FaceTime to phone home. So when I came down here, although it's only, you know, 6-7 hours away in the car, it seemed an eternity away. So it was different, and I became very homesick during that with the loss of my father, the first time I'd truly been away from home, all of those things. And then on top of that, about 4 or 5 months into my time at Coventry, my previous coach that had me in the Rangers reserves, he was appointed new head coach at Dundee United, and he phoned me up to ask me if I'd be interested in coming up there. And that really turned my head as well, with being a little bit homesick, about being settled. And I chose to go back up. And yet, when you look back and you reflect on your career, there are decisions that you make that you regret. And I do regret leaving Coventry City at that time. I really would have loved to make a career for it down here. So, you know, you live and die by your decisions. I decided to go back up the road, but as I've said, in hindsight, I really do wish I'd stayed and made a real go of it.
Yeah, was obviously when you first came down, Phil Neal was the manager, and he had a very, very bad run of results over the Christmas and into January and February, and ultimately got the sack with Big Ron Atkinson coming in. How did you find that transition?
Okay, yeah, I played a number of times for Ron, and you know, he was a larger than life character. There's no doubt about that, and it was a great experience. But also, when he arrived, he brought in Gordon Strachan, which was, you know, a terrific appointment, and one that I was extremely, you know, pleased about, because I was an Aberdeen supporter growing up. So Gordon was one of my boyhood heroes. So him coming into the club was a big thing for me. So, you know, in that respect, it was good. You know, obviously, you know, Phil leaving was a real disappointment. He'd put his trust in me, and I didn't manage to repay him in the right way. But Ron coming in, you know, as I've said, a larger than life character. It was a great experience for myself. I just wish I had persevered, and I wish I'd stayed longer than I actually did.
What type of manager was Phil like, Stephen? Because at the time there was the program, wasn't there, of I Don't Like Orange, the thing with Graham Taylor, and we were talking about this, me and Jim, last week, how he came across, well, the way they edited it, he came across poorly. And basically just repeated everything that Graham was saying. But what sort of a man was he as a manager then?
It's difficult to say, because I didn't spend enough time with him. And to be honest with you, you know, I felt my own performances, you know, I'd let him down. You know, he'd put a lot of faith and trust in me. And, you know, when a manager loses his job, we should all feel accountability around that. So, you know, I can't really remember too much. You know, he seemed a very genuine guy, a very good guy. But in reflection, I would be wrong in saying anything too much on that, because I can't really remember the brief spell in any great detail.
No. Claudio pointed out the bookings, but if you look at the games you actually played, the first 13 games, you had 6 clean sheets. Well, you know, if you were that bad, you wouldn't have had clean sheets every other week, would you?
No, and Jim, the truth is, though, as I said, you know, in amongst some of the disappointment, I actually had some really strong performances within that. I did. You know, as you've said, 6 and 13, you would say in the Premier League for Coventry City, that's a great return. But the reality was that there was still inconsistencies around that. And I probably, in the other 7 games, I probably made some mistakes that resulted in opportunities or goals. It was just that inconsistency. You know, I had shown in certain games the quality and the reason that Coventry had signed me, but in others, as I've said, just that inexperience showed. So, as I've said, there was some good moments and some bad moments, but you can't afford to have that when you're a central defender.
So what would you say was your best moment in a Coventry shirt?
I don't know about best moments, but I can remember some of the games. I had a really strong game at home to Liverpool. In that particular game, I had a really strong game with Sheffield Wednesday at home. That game in particular, I remember. I always remember after that game, actually, when I came into the dressing room, Big Ron asked the rest of the squad to applaud my performance. As a young player, and it was a very memorable moment for me, that because I was still trying to find my feet within the club. But as I've said, I had some of those types of performances, but inconsistency, I would say, was the key.
So did the club, when you sorry, Claudio,
I was going to say, who did you partner at the time? Who's your other central defender? Was it David Rennie then? I can't. I'm trying to.
Yeah, there was several actually. David Boost as well.
Of course,
David Boost, David Rennie. I even partnered Gary Gillespie in a couple of games. Gary was at the club. Gary was terrific with me actually when I came down. I ended up sharing a house with Gary for 5 or 6 months, and he was a real father figure to me while I was at the club. And of course, we had Mr. Agruzovic behind us, who, when I returned as manager, was still there. So, there was some great people at the club, and some good memories.
So when Dundee United came in for you, did Ron or the club try and persuade you to stay?
Again, yeah, I think they did actually. I think they did try and get me to stay. But at that time, as I've said, I was really determined to move back because of the situation around being homesick, around the loss of my father and all those things. And of course, I had a real attachment to the head coach at Dundee United. He was one that had a real influence on my career and was very prominent in my own development. So I felt that this would be the right move. But as I've said, in hindsight, I wish I hadn't. But I decided at that time it would be best to go.
Well, should we move on to your time as manager?
Yes, of course.
You were building a good career at Falkirk and building a strong reputation there. When did you hear that Coventry City wanted you as a manager?
Well, it's interesting because I think I maybe did 3 to 3.5 years at Falkirk, and they were challenging years again around the finances of the club. We had real issues and real challenges around that area, and because of that, we decided upon a strategy of developing our own young players and then signing undervalued players that we also felt we could develop, and we wanted to trade our way out of the financial difficulties. So that model, we'd been working towards it for 2.5 years, and after that period, the reputation was growing about what we were doing within the club. And then I'm trying to think who, before Mark became the manager the first time, who was the previous manager?
It was Andy Thorne.
Andy Thorne, yes. So when Andy Thorne was sacked, Coventry actually interviewed me at that time. And I had several interviews with them during that period and went down to London to meet the owner. And I spoke then, and I actually thought at that time that I was going to get the job. But they phoned up to say that they decided to go with Mark Robbins because Mark had a greater experience and understanding of the English market. And that being very true, as I learned to understand when I came down as manager. But so Mark went into the job, and of course I continued managing at Falkirk, but Mark's tenure at that time was only 5 or 6 months, would that be correct, before he moved again. And then immediately when Mark moved, Coventry came back in for myself and offered me the opportunity to take the job as head coach.
So was that Steve Waggett?
It was Steve, yes, it was Steve at the time.
And you met Joy?
I met Joy, I met Steve, and I met Tim Fisher as well. So I discussed with them the plans for the club, and obviously they wanted me to try to implement many of the things, the strategies that we had been applying at Falkirk, and try and bring some degree of stability to the club.
Yeah.
So how soon after you joined as manager did the move to Northampton happen? What the timeline?
Well, I think I came in maybe in late March. Would that be correct? I'm unsure actually. Was it March?
Yeah, I think it was March. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in March. So there was maybe just around 2 months left of the season, and then it was in the summer that obviously the move to Northampton happened. So it was quite early into the reign as head coach.
And did you have wind of this before then? Did you know it was possibly on the cards that we're going to move out?
No, I knew there was issues surrounding the stadium, but of course, when we discussed it, the hope was that they would be resolved and we would stay at the stadium. But there was always that slight possibility. But I never actually thought it would happen. But unfortunately, it did.
My nephew was, I think the email, I don't know if you remember him, Matthew Hyde. He was the club photographer and did the programs, graphic designer, and he used to try and get me to come down, which I did do to Northampton. And I used to sit behind the dugout, Stephen. So you probably listen to me, don't you? The usual stuff. When's he going to bring a sub on? Stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it was, it's so difficult. I can imagine it's difficult for you lot involved because there's going to be a backlash. And it's difficult for the fan base, wasn't it, Jim? Because people still wanted to go and support the team, and some people wanted to protest, and it was absolute nuts, wasn't it, Jim? It
was, and I took the decision to follow the team and support the team. I wanted to see them play. I didn't want to have to worry about what was going on off the field, and I guess that was probably what you were trying to do, Stephen, as manager. Keep focus, keep the players focus on the pitch rather than off the pitch.
Yeah, very much so. And I look back at the period in charge, and it, of course, it was an exceptionally challenging period. But I also look back and some of my leadership decision making, some of the aspects of my management. I reflect on those and know that I could have done better during that period. Now there were good elements to that. There was the development of some really good young players. The challenges of going to Northampton, the points deduction, all of those things, and overcoming them. I'm very proud of that. But at the same time, I made many, many mistakes during my time there. And it goes back to a little bit like my time as a player coming down to Coventry. I was a relatively inexperienced and young manager. And I came with a real energy and a real belief in the way that I worked. But I also lacked real understanding of leadership methods and ways to go about aspects, and how to empower people and bring people with me. I was very much a pace-setting type manager that was desperate to bring success to the club and to bring that success as quickly as possible.
Jim, sorry, Stephen.
Jim,
didn't we turn over the 10 points quite quickly, though, at the start of the season?
Yeah.
It was an incredible start. I personally think if you hadn't have been deducted the 10 points, without that pressure, knowing you've got to get those 10 points quite quickly, I think playoffs would have been on the cards. I don't really think, Stephen. I think we'd...
The other thing, Claudio, was that I always remember this. And again, it's there's great lessons to be learned as a manager and as a young manager, because you start as a young manager to believe the hype and you start to think you're better than you actually are. And the reality was that we had made, huge strides that season in difficult circumstances. I remember going to Rotherham, I think just around the New Year time. And I think we won away from home at Rotherham 3-1, which just put us on the edge of the promotion playoff places. But that day at Rotherham, we lost Callum Wilson to a shoulder injury. And I think that put Callum out for 3 months. And then almost the following week, we lost Leon Clark to Wolverhampton. I don't think Leon played after that. Now, those two players have been pivotal to our success. But as a young manager, you begin to think that the success is based around the tactics and, the management. Well, the reality is in football, players are key to success. And when we lost those players, the two of those players that season, we almost fell off a cliff. We really did. And I tried to make many amendments to the team, tried to change several aspects, but the reality was to replace those two was near on impossible. And that had the biggest bearing on that season.
That's a quote from Alex Ferguson, isn't it, where he says, it's not about the tactics, it's about my players. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, isn't it, Stephen?
No, I am saying, I think that, listen, great managers need great players. There's no doubt about it. You're seeing who would be, apart from Sir Alec, who would be seen as probably one of the best managers that's ever lived. You're seeing Pep Guardiola at present. He's lost some key players, some pivotal players. Some players, are now beyond their years, but others, he's lost them through injury. And the change has been quite significant. I think Pep's going about his business in the same way, but ultimately, if you don't have those players, it becomes a real challenge. And that was the biggest learning curve for me. I'd been 3 years of relative success at Falkirk, then a year at Coventry, where you start to believe the hype, you start to believe, that you're actually better than you actually are. And it was a real learning curve for me. It was a real humbling experience for me, and a very important one, that, a manager certainly needs really good players.
I remember the first half of that season really well, because we were there or thereabouts, right up, as you said, till to January. We had a great win at MK Dons.
That's right.
Do you remember that one?
2 free kicks that day, wasn't it?
Oh, that was Chris Maguire, wasn't it?
Maguire.
Yeah. I think he only touched the ball twice and scored 2 goals.
Yeah. But you see that from Haaland as well these days. He doesn't touch it much, but he does the effective things.
Exactly, yeah. And I was at the Boxing Day game against Peterborough, where we really did play well that day against a very strong Peterborough side.
That's right.
Did we win? What
was the score that day? 3-1, 4-1?
4-2.
4-2 it was,
4-2,
wasn't it?
Yeah. But that was Callum and Leon at their best. I think they got 2 each.
That's right. And they were both incredible that season.
Yes.
And both, because a big part of the way I wanted the team to play was to be very aggressive in the pressure, and those two were very good at that. they pressed really effectively from the front, and we were a really exciting transitional team. But as I've said, if you take those two out of the team, it had such a big impact.
Yeah, and we also had players like Frank Musa and Carl
Absolutely.
Baker, who
Yes.
really they chipped in with goals and were key parts of the team, I think, weren't they?
They truly were. And again, when I look back in reflection at decision making from myself, when I spoke earlier about, there was some real challenges, but there was some decisions that I made as a younger, naive manager. I look at allowing the likes of Carl Baker to go at that time, which was a wrong decision in hindsight, but I thought it was the right decision at that moment in time. He'd had a really strong season, but for some reason at that time, I felt we could be more effective in that area, and I was wrong with that, but again, these are decisions that you live and die by, and a manager has to get most of these correct. And unfortunately, especially going into my second full season in charge, I got too many of them wrong.
Yeah.
We had John Fleck as well, didn't we?
We had Fleck. Fleck was I've got to say, John was a terrific player during my time there. And when I arrived at the club, and at his time at Rangers, he'd played either as a 10 or a wide player coming in off the side. But I always thought he could play as a 6, a playmaker, almost a quarterback. And he did that along with Connor Thomas for me first season to real effect. He was an outstanding player during my time, and he really grew as a young player to go on and have an excellent career.
There's a player who's obviously doing great things at Tottenham now. He would have been, he was in the academy when you were there. James Maddison. Could you see from an early age that he was going to be a good player? Because there was nothing of him, was there, when he was younger? He was so small, wasn't he? He's quite thin lad, wasn't he? But it turned out to be a terrific player. Could you see it was going to happen?
I would like to say yes, but the truth is, in my role that I'm currently doing just now, which is head individual development, it's actually really difficult to be sure on any player's development. I mean this. Often, players surprise you that come through and go on and have great careers. So much of it is down to the attitude and the mentality of the player. But the one thing about James was he had incredible ability and belief in his own qualities. From very early on, I think I brought James in to train with the first team group at the age of 16, and he was a player that immediately, when he trained with the first team, wanted to control the game, wanted the ball, would demand the ball from the senior players. He had just that air of confidence about him and belief. And he was the sort of player you don't see too often, but a player that can control the speed of a game. He can speed the game up when it's required, but he can slow it down. And there's not many players that have that understanding or that belief. And James was just one of those players. So he arrived with great technical qualities. I know he's told some stories about certain things that I did with him. And that was because the most important thing for me around James was just making him understand the standards that were required to be a top football player and the attitude required to be a top football player, because I believed if he could grow in those areas, then he was always going to be an exceptional talent. So my job was really to try and shape and mould him as a young individual. And, I hope that I had some bearing on that, just pointing them in the right direction at times. But really, as I've found, the older I've gotten, the more I'm involved with young player development, it very much comes down to them. We merely as coaches just steer them and try to point them in the right direction. I think when I look back, that's what I tried to do with James. But he was an exceptional talent. There's no doubt about it. And I remember playing QPR reserves down at QPR one Wednesday night, and I remember at half time in the game walking down the stairs, and Harry Redknapp was the manager there at the time, and he stopped just to say to me, "Wow, that young 10 you've got playing tonight's a special player." And of course it was James. So, you know, it didn't take a lot to really be able to see that he was going to be a special football player. But he also, the one thing I'll say is he came from a very good family. He had really good support around him. And the most important thing was that he got games from an early age and was allowed to develop.
Do you think that comes from your experience, Stephen? You know, the advice you're given. Do you think because you probably thought, you're saying about your father, you sort of maybe lack that advice, and you feel like you sort of pass on what you probably think you didn't get from somebody else?
Claudio, it's amazing you say that, because in my role today, that's kind of how I look at my role. You know, I look at my role as a mentor to these young players. I work at present with 6 of what we call our high potential players at Brentford. 4 of them are our first team players. 2 of them are from our B team and transitional players. And although I oversee all aspects of their development, really I look upon myself as more of a mentor to the young players and a stabiliser to them. You know, something that I always felt that I missed when I was a young player, because losing my father, who was such an influence on me, was really important to some of my decision making, especially when I look back at my early years and some of the mistakes that I made. So I always try to be very straight with our young players and straight with the likes of James Maddison, because I do feel that that was an element that I missed as a young player.
So just one last question on your the development side now at Brentford. So how do you coax in these young lads to come to Brentford when you've got so many London sides who obviously traditionally are bigger than Brentford? So what's the appeal? How do you sell it to the families, basically?
Well, it's not really part of my remit to do so. But what I will say is that you have hit the nail on the head. There is a real challenge around that with so many top clubs in the area. But it was part of the reason, 7-8 years ago, that Brentford closed the academy. They closed the academy. Now we've just reopened it because it's part of the stipulation of the Premier League, and now is a good time. With being a Premier League club, we also feel now we have the ability to attract the better players. But at that time, especially when they were in League One and they had an academy, what would happen was that when you had a good player within your academy, the big guns would come and just cherry pick them away. So that was a problem. So at that time, they closed the academy and focused on a B team, which involved good scouting, plus trying to take players that had maybe fallen out of the big clubs that we thought were undervalued players. That was the model. It's changed now, but being a Premier League club, I think it's far easier to attract these players. But it's going to take now, 6, 7, 8 years before we really see the effects of the academy, before we start seeing the real crops coming through.
Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to that season at Northampton if I can. And you mentioned losing Callum and Leon Clark in January. It was a phenomenal challenge for you, and obviously the results really did suffer. We lost our goal scorers, didn't we?
Absolutely.
What were you trying to do to rectify things at that stage?
Well, Jim, one of the things, again, in reflection, that we did not put into place was a recruitment structure. And I think when I spoke at the start of the show about one of the things that Mark did particularly well when he came back a second time was he put in place a really good recruitment team and structure. And through his reign there, you really seen the fruits of that. I didn't do that, and it's one of the regrets. We actually went through the process of trying to recruit somebody in that area, but we never managed to finalise it. And ultimately, it cost me. And as I've said in reflection, it was a mistake that we made, that we didn't manage to put that in, because when you lose players like Leon Clark and Callum Wilson, you need a good process in place to find the replacements. And we didn't have that. And at that time, my knowledge of players within the English game in the lower leagues wasn't particularly strong. So my ability to be able to find a replacement wasn't good. And I think that throughout my time at Coventry, I think that one of the things that let me down the most was my recruitment. I thought when I arrived there, we actually had the nucleus of a good squad. We also had the emergence of some really good young players, but I don't think I ever managed to get that right. And I think I made a lot of mistakes in the market. So replacing those in January was difficult.
Were the players that you wanted that the owner wouldn't let you buy?
No, I wouldn't say that at all.
No.
I would say I would put we obviously had a limited budget at that time, because when I came in, the budget I think sat at 4.5 million, and by the time I'd left, we'd brought it down to something around the 2.5 million. So that was part of my remit, to reduce the budget, but at the same time try to bring through our own young players. You can do that within that, because the cost base can change around the wages of the young players. Wages of your own young talent generally are less than what you pay to bring players in. But I wouldn't blame, no, not at all. I think I would put a lot of the blame on myself that I didn't put in place. And maybe the club should have supported me more on this. But again, when I look back, the one thing that I really missed, and Steve Waggett was great support to me when I was in at the club. He really was. But I think that any young manager really needs a sporting director, somebody there to steer and guide them, and somebody that takes the pressures of recruitment and those aspects away from him. And probably I got involved in far too many areas for a young manager, and rather than just be able to focus solely on the coaching of the team.
Right. Because when I look back at the second half of that season, and I look at some of the players we had, there's a real mixed bag, aren't there? People like Chuba Akpong,
Yes.
who later became a big goal scorer with Middlesbrough, but he just showed nothing for Coventry at that time. Nathan Delfonso is another one who went on to have a sort of career, but he didn't show anything at Coventry, did he?
No. But again, around the recruitment, the process to bring them in wasn't a thorough enough process.
Right.
And at the time we were taking advice from certain people, using certain agents to recruit those players. And that's always a dangerous game, and we paid the price for that.
Right.
Akpom was a young Arsenal player of great potential, but really wasn't ready at the time. And Delfonso, he was a player at the time, again, with high potential, but just didn't manage to perform in the manner that the likes of Wilson and Clark had. Again, as I've said, the blame is not on those players. The blame is on the process and the recruitment that we did at that time. And I genuinely mean this, that we got so much of that wrong, so much, and it was extremely costly.
Yeah.
But
So
sorry,
did you not inherit a system then, a recruitment system from Andy Thorne?
No, there was nothing really in place. We had one person in charge. Well, one person that was involved in recruitment, Brown, and that was all that we had in place at the time. And to be honest with you, I didn't lean on him enough either. You know, I probably should have used his knowledge far more than I actually did. And that's what I'm saying. When I look back at my time, I probably didn't utilise certain people enough, nor did I build the correct structures to support us in those key areas. Sometimes as a young manager, you just do not realise how important recruitment is. As I've said to you, I learnt some harsh lessons along the way, but sometimes you think your coaching methods and your tactical details are more important. And the reality is that I learnt those lessons and they're not. The most important things are the players.
But weren't you a bit limited, though, financially, Stephen, to send scouts here, there and everywhere? I mean, isn't the budget part of the problem if you haven't got enough cash to do this?
Yeah, listen, you know, when you don't have the money, you have to be, in my opinion, more ahead of the curve in other areas. And those other areas should have been that we invested in a good recruitment process where we could identify good players or undervalued players and bring them in. But we didn't do that. And all we ended up doing was competing with some of the other bigger clubs, not bigger clubs, shall I say, but more clubs with a greater financial backing at that time. And we were challenging them to get players, and we couldn't pay the money that these clubs could pay. So we had to do it in a different way, and we never put those, as I've said, processes in place. And ultimately, it cost us.
Well, I think there's no recruitment process in place. Even when Mark Robbins came back, I think that's
No,
when
you're right. No,
that's when it changed.
absolutely right. And that was one of the main changes that Mark put in place.
Yeah.
And it was a key change. You know, it was a massive change for the club, and I think, you know, you're still seeing the benefits of that now.
So the following season, you know, we obviously came back to Coventry, how did you feel about that?
Well, I've got to say, I always remember this as well, that we, look, I really, really enjoyed my time as head coach at Coventry. I did, and I got really emotionally attached to the club. You know, I had the opportunity to potentially go to Huddersfield in that season and chose not to because I felt that I wanted to take Coventry back to where they deserve to be. I just wanted to do it too quickly. But when we returned to the Rico, well, one of my memories was that we obviously won the game 1-0. I think we played, was it Colchester? Who did we play in our return game?
It was Gillingham.
Gillingham, that's correct. I think we won the game 1-0. Was it Newble that scored that night?
Yeah, Frank Newble, yeah.
Frank Newble, yeah, scored that night. And I actually was in tears that night. You know, I was really emotional that night because the challenges that we'd been through, the journey that we'd been as a club, and then to finally return there and win in front of what was a sellout crowd was an amazing night. And I hoped that would be the start of some great times. It obviously didn't turn out to be, but it was a very emotional night for myself. Because I became very, very attached to the club and I wanted to bring real success to the club. But the one thing as well, and again, it's not an excuse, it's something that I should have changed and adapted to. I obviously was a manager that wanted to play high pressure football, but also I wanted my teams to really play. And I don't know if you can remember, but the state of the Rico pitch that year.
Oh, it was terrible.
We returned to the Rico that year, and there'd been a concert on it, I think, maybe 2 weeks before we actually played that game. The pitch had not been prepared at all. And it turned out to be a real mud bath, which again affected performances. Recruitment wasn't right. The pitch wasn't right. But at the same time, again, I look back, I should have adapted more. I should have changed the style a little bit more to suit what we're playing on. And those are lessons that you learn. But there was things around that weren't ideal. You know, I even remember that I wanted the pitch size to be a certain width. And again, that wasn't possible because of the rugby on there every week, and they wouldn't change the width size. I wanted it slightly tighter so it would suit our pressure game. And I always remember as well turning up for one of our league games and the grass hadn't been cut. And I remember we had a strength and conditioning coach called Pete Turney, and Pete actually had to cut the grass that day prior to a league game. So there was that's true. There was many challenges at that time.
Yeah.
There really was, and some things that were far from ideal. But along the way, many things, as I've said, that I wish I'd done better myself.
It's I just got a vision of this guy with a tiny lawnmower going up and down the pitch with a very long extension lead.
No, it's true. He had to cut the grass that day.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And when you look back at our record at the Rico that year, after the Gillingham game, I think we won the following week, but then we didn't. We won very few home games.
Very few.
Yeah. And you know, we were just keeping our head above water in the division, even without a points deduction. We were struggling, weren't we?
We were struggling badly at that time. You know, we actually made quite a promising start, and I remember because who was it we signed? The French defender from Sheffield Wednesday.
Reader Johnson.
Yeah. And Redder was in my opinion, Redder's a player that never fulfilled his true potential. Redder had the attributes to be a really top player. Redder should have been playing high championship, low Premier League. There's no doubt about it based on his attributes, you know, and he didn't for several reasons fulfill that, but he was going to be a pivotal player for us because one of the things and one of the reasons that we brought him in was that, you know, the previous season, I didn't think we had the aerial power that the lower leagues require, and Redder was terrific in that area. And if you look at the early part of the season, we began to get momentum, and I think we went to Scunthorpe on a Tuesday night, and Redder was playing that night, and we went 1-0 up, and I think Redder got sent off.
Yeah.
And I think we lost the game 2-1 with a late goal. That was a real turning point because that night, if we'd won at Scunthorpe, we went into the playoffs. We lost at Scunthorpe, we lost Redder, and then after that, he didn't play many games. He got an injury and was out for quite a period of time. Yeah. And we went on a really disappointing run after that. Yeah. We just couldn't.
Do you know who scored for the winner for Scunthorpe that night? Your old Falkirk man, Lyle Taylor.
Was it Lyle? That's incredible. I was actually speaking about him the other day. Danny Cowley phoned me about one of our players that he's just recently signed, and we were discussing Lyle, who's down at Colchester now. But it was
Is he
Lyle.
Still playing?
Yeah, he is. Yeah, Lyle's still playing. He scored 2 at the weekend, actually. So, you know, he was a really interesting character. Took a bit of management, but worth the management.
Well, he was linked with Coventry a couple of times, I think.
Yeah. He actually, when I first came into Brentford, he was a player they were considering at the time. He was going really well in the Championship, and he was an option to sign. But no, I'll need to remind him of that one day. That was a real change in our season.
You ruined my season.
Yes. Now listen, there's many things ruined that season, but momentum is an amazing aspect, when it changes.
Do you think that I know you talked about the youngsters, and we had some really outstanding ones with Jordan Willis and Ryan Haynes, Connor Thomas. Do you think that maybe you overplayed some of these youngsters?
Yeah, I think that my reliance on them was probably too great. I think that we probably didn't have enough experience within the team. But I think I go back to, again, the recruitment, because if I'd got the recruitment right, then I don't think there'd have been such a reliance on these young players. But because we didn't get the recruitment right, the players we brought in weren't of a good enough level. It meant there was a greater reliance on our young players to push them quicker. And I think that that's what happened, But I also think that, when I look back again at my time there, I said this early on, I was a little bit of a pace setter. I didn't empower enough people in the club. I didn't allow enough people to challenge me within the football club and create that type of culture that's long lasting. And these were mistakes I made. I know that even around the academy, I was desperate for standards to change so quickly, but I made some mistakes even around that in my decision making. So, but that's a young and experienced manager.
You're only 51 now, aren't you, Stephen?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
So, would you consider going back into management? Because it sounds like you want to put a lot of things right.
No, it's not that. It's funny. I'm doing a postgrad in strategic leadership just now at Liverpool Uni, and it's allowed me a lot of time to reflect on it's one of the aspects that I really enjoy about the course. The assignments, there's a lot of self-reflection, a lot of critique in and around that. And I look at myself as a young manager, and I look at certain things around it and where I lacked guidance, where I lacked support, all of those elements. And I think to myself, that a young manager requires that. So when you ask me about I would never say never to anything if it was the right situation, but probably I'm thinking more along the lines of being a sporting director.
Oh, we're looking for one.
Sorry,
we're looking for one at the minute.
Is that right? Yeah. Listen, it's definitely it's the reason I took this course was that I've seen a lot of processes in place at our own football club that I really like. And I've also experienced it at the sharp end about what a manager requires and the support he requires. And also the direction. A manager also needs pointed in the right direction. And with the right KPIs in place and the right strategies in place, then you can support them in the right way. And so one thing I love about our own football club, that we don't use these strategies and processes and data to hit the manager over the head with. We use it to support them and steer them and guide them and help them. And from the lessons I've learned as a coach and manager, that's probably why I'm more intrigued with the sporting directorship, because I've made the mistakes and I understand what is required.
Jim?
It's fascinating, and you're not the only person who thinks back on their career and looks at where they went right and where they went wrong. It's I think it's an important part of life. I think we all do it.
No, it is. It's really important. And again, although I critique and I like to look at areas that I must improve, there was elements around my time at Coventry I was very proud of.
Mm.
You know, some of the football we played, the first season, the young players that we brought through, a lot of those things were real positives, but at the same time, there was a lot of mistakes in amongst that.
Yeah.
And that's the disappointing thing. And hopefully, you know, I've learned from those mistakes.
Well, I think your memory at Coventry is a strong one. I think, you know, the fans realised that you had a pretty tough card dealt with you, pretty tough hand dealt, and you went about it in a very positive way, and you gave us the first half of that season at Northampton was some of the most exciting football that we'd seen for many years. Certainly, I think we got 77 goals that season, which was the most for about 40 years.
Nice. Yeah.
The Bristol City game was bonkers, wasn't it? At home, the 5-4.
Yeah.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.
It was amazing. It was amazing. And again, you know, just on the goals, and again, you know, when I spoke at the start about, you know, talent and people, you know, how it's difficult to identify talent. Even if I tell you the story around Callum Wilson, this is true, that Callum, when I arrived at the club, was training with the reserve team, and I believe, or the 21s, and I believe he was going to be let go at the end of the season. But the reality was, after my first training session, we went over to watch Lee Carsley training the 21s, and Callum caught the eye. Now, the truth is, it might have been another session where Callum wasn't particularly good in. Sometimes it's just chance. And so immediately we took him up to the group. But even in the final 2 months of that season and the entire pre-season, apart from his final game at Mansfield, where I think he scored a hat-trick, he had been not absolutely convincing. And I remember the lead up to the first game of the season, we were still undecided as to who would lead the line. And in our thoughts, it was either going to be Wilson and Clark or Musa and Clark. We hadn't decided, but the game at Mansfield, I think he scored 2 or 3. We split the groups. That we played one game at Oxford on the Saturday and one game at Mansfield on the Friday. And Callum played on the Friday and scored, as I've said, the goals. But in the lead up to it, on the Thursday training when we were beginning to shape the team, I put Musa up with Clark, and then I put Callum up with Clark, and immediately you could see it was just a match made in heaven with the two of those.
Yeah.
And they linked up brilliantly in that training. But going into the first game of the season, although I thought in Callum that he had some really good qualities, especially speed and movement at that time, that could disturb any defence, I still was not absolutely convinced. But it's amazing once the player starts playing games and growing in confidence and belief. And within 6 or 7 weeks, he was transformed. And when you talk about the Bristol City game, that game in particular, he was quite incredible that day. You know, he was. I think that's the game that I think hit home to everybody, that we have a special talent on our hands here. But certainly in the lead up to that, I'm not going to sit here and say I absolutely seen that, but it's amazing how it develops: chance, opportunity, growth, and then you see what he's gone on to do. It's amazing.
Stephen, it's been a fascinating hour or more, and I really appreciate you coming on and being so honest and frank about your time as a player and a manager. And it's been really interesting. So thank you very, very much.
The pleasure.
Thanks for coming on, Stephen. It has been really, just absolutely brilliant. And really nice for you to give us your time, basically.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on tonight.
Now, we should tell people, Jim, shouldn't we, where to contact us. We're useless at this, aren't we? Keep forgetting. So what's the email, Jim?
My email, claryborton@gmail.com. And also, people should, if they listen to the show and they enjoy it, or even if they don't enjoy it, leave a review on Spotify or Apple, because it helps our ratings. And anybody's got ideas for future podcasts, famous games, famous seasons, famous managers, then we'll take them on board.
And also go to the Sky Blue archive, because you can see episodes on there.
That's right. Yeah, the new website, skybluearchive.co.uk. We've now got all the matches back to 1969 on there, with all the stats and everything. And I've got to write Stephen's pen picture. That's what I've got to do, which tonight will help me a lot. So, so thanks again, Stephen. Really enjoyed it. I'll see you around Leamington.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah,
definitely. Right. Ta-ra all.
Bye bye.
Immediate company dismissed. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Lovely.